Hello, here's a version of this presentation I just gave at a UB conference. That's Utah Board of International Educators. And they didn't record it, so I'm recording it by myself. And this might someday be an article, but it's not yet. So it's basically about syllabi and how the language in them reveals something about their purposes. So just to warm us up a little bit, because I don't know if everyone watching this is going to be an ESL teacher, I want you to look at the following sentences and think about how you would teach them if your learners in an ESL class had to learn these sentences for some reason. So here's the first sentence. Students will evaluate sources and attribute them appropriately to a writing style. Okay. I don't know about you, but so this is actually from a syllabus. Students won't necessarily interpret this as a command, as something that they're supposed to do, because it really just looks like a declarative in the future tense. So you might need to point that out to students. Beyond that, they might need to know some words in particular, like attribute as a verb and its argument structure. They might not understand the referent for them. It's a pronoun and it refers to something else in the same sentence in this case, but students might need that pointed out to them. There are some top-down concerns, like what is the purpose of the sentence? There's some bottom-up concerns, like what do the words mean? Stuff like that. A lot you could focus on as an ESL teacher. Here's another one. Students can engage in a complex email and message exchange, which includes detailed or technical information delivered in a clear but concise manner. Whoosh, that's a long sentence. So you could focus on the vocabulary. I mean, again, this is it's from a syllabus, spoiler alert. It's a learning outcome. So it's telling the students something that they'll have to do by the end of the course, but they won't, let's say, appreciating that top-down function, the purpose of this sentence, which is to give, an expectation or really a command to students in order to succeed in the course. Even if students understand that, they won't necessarily understand the message if they don't know what the words mean, right? So you could focus on vocabulary, specific things like the adjective use of the word detailed. Students will often see ed and think it must be a verb in the past tense, but in this case, it's actually a past participle. And really it's the form of the, I don't know, I would interpret this as noun plus ed in the same way as like four-legged, meaning information that has a lot of details in it. But I don't know, students might not know that. They might not interpret this word the way that the writer meant for it to be interpreted, right? So you could focus on that and other similar adjectives. The coordinator but between two adjectives, that's something a lot of students might not have seen before. They're used to seeing but between clauses, but not between individual words. So that's something you could focus on. There's quite a lot here. You could come up with at least 3 different lessons just from this sentence. Here's another one. This one's really kind of a nightmare. I'll let you read it. But again, it's a statement with a specific purpose in a syllabus, right? This is telling students who meet these criteria to go and do something. It's basically a command, a directive like the other 2 sentences. But again, students might not know that because it looks to them like a future tense declarative, right? It might look like that to them. So because this sentence is so long, it actually only has 1 clause in it. The clause with the finite verb will, and every other verb in here is non-finite. And students might not know what a non-finite verb is, but this is a good, maybe not really a good sentence to teach it, but it does have a lot of non-finite verbs. So you could turn this into a lesson on non-finite verbs if you wanted to. Or just how to parse very long subjects, because like everything until will is the subject of this sentence, right? So, you could build quite an interesting lesson out of that, although I don't think I would want to use this sentence to start with just because the vocabulary is such a high level. And, ironically, this sentence, I mean, if you read it, it's intended for students with disabilities. So someone with a learning disability, for example, is supposed to read this sentence and know what to do. That's not really a given, even for native speakers of English, and definitely not for second language speakers, right? So yeah, this sentence is kind of a nightmare. So this video is for a project that I have done, and again, it might be an article one day, but right now it's just this presentation. It's a corpus study of syllabi. I got that backwards. A corpus study of syllabi. Corpus study means you gather a lot of language data together in one place and then analyze it, usually with the aid of some kind of software. That software is called a concordancer. Basically, it lets you do things that would be very laborious to do by hand really quickly. And that includes things like which words are the most common in this body of text, what forms do the words occur in, what words often occur together. We call that a chunk meaning like a bunch of things stuck together. So, which chunks are common in this particular corpus? Again, a collection of language data. And the reason I collected language data from syllabi is because I wanted to look at how, first of all, how readable they were. Second of all, how the language in them predicts or supports a certain view of their higher order purpose, right? The purpose of the syllabus as a kind of document. And the purpose of the syllabus as a kind of document has been studied before. The higher order purpose of this stack of papers that students get at the beginning of every semester. What is it for? These researchers, Parks and Harris, separated the purposes of syllabi into three categories. One is a contract, basically formalizing the expectations of two parties, in this case, the instructor and the student. Also, the syllabus is a kind of record keeping. The document has the purpose of, forming a record of who taught what, when, to who, with what expectations, et cetera, with what textbooks. And that's for the administration of the university or the department. And also, a syllabus is sometimes an informal communicative document from the instructor to students, telling them what they think are best practices, although not necessarily requirements. Things like, check your email every day, stuff like that. So I wanted to look at the lower order language concerns in particular, and then see if there were some kind of connection with the higher order concerns of syllabi, and then also see how those feed into each other as making a syllabus particularly difficult to read or easy to read, or easier to read if understood as understood as a document with a particular purpose. Yep. Did I skip a slide? Yes. Okay. In case you've never seen a concordancer before, or corpus linguistics before. Again, a corpus is a collection of language data. Concordancer is the software that goes through the language data and does things that would be really hard to do by hand. For example, finding out which words are the most common, which otherwise you just have to read the whole, the collection of data and count all the words, which would be really hard. Software can do that much more easily. So, as an example of the kind of thing that a concordancer could show you that would be really hard to figure out by hand, from the 3 sentences in the introduction of this video, there were 55 unique words. 7 of them were in the academic word list, which are words that, most ESL teachers think would help their undergrads after they matriculate out of ESL. The most common word was or. And again, that would be really hard to figure out by hand. And that's kind of interesting because the most common word in English is definitely not or, but it was out of these 3 sentences. So, again, chunks are groups of words that come together. The most common word or occurred in these chunks that you see here, or other, or auxiliary, or message, or technical. Basically, none more commonly than the other. So that wasn't very informative. But again, this is the kind of thing that software can do very quickly that would be really hard to do by hand. Okay. So as for my particular study, my study was not just on those 3 words. It was on the syllabi that I gathered. I gathered some syllabi from around campus and took a corpus linguistics approach to analyze them. And why did I do that? Basically, I wanted to know how readable syllabi were. And one way of doing that was to see which are the words that are really common on syllabi, and see maybe we should be teaching our students those words, especially if they're different from the words that are, in academic writing more generally. And this is really important for ESL teachers because when our students leave our programs, they start their first semester as undergrads or sometimes grad students, they get a stack of these syllabi the first day of class, the first day of the semester. And if those documents are hard to read, that sets a really bad tone for the rest of the semester for them. Not to mention, some instructors really do want students to read the syllabi very carefully, as evidenced by a recent meme that was let's see, an instructor hid $50 somewhere on campus, and in the syllabus it said where the money was, and basically no one got the money because the students didn't read the syllabus. So, I mean, the subtext of that meme was that the instructor expected and hoped that the students would read the syllabus carefully. Not every instructor does, but you never know what kind of instructor you're going to get as an undergrad, right? So this kind of document, the syllabus, is really important for, in some cases, for students to read, and students usually get them the first day of class after finishing ESL. So it's really important for ESL teachers to know how hard these are to read. And I had never seen anyone else taking a corpus linguistics approach to syllabi. So that's sort of why I did it too. I just noticed there's a gap in the literature, and it's the kind of thing you would expect someone to do, right? So I did it. As for what I did in particular to gather my syllabi, I went around campus at SUU, Southern Utah University, and just knocked on offices and requested syllabi from first-year courses in undergrad programs, not grad programs, and not like third-year or fourth-year syllabi, all first-year syllabi. And I whittled it down to just one per instructor and one per course, because, you know, some instructors were very generous. They gave me like 5 syllabi, but I didn't want those instructors to be overrepresented in the syllabus. I wanted the syllabus, sorry, the corpus to be a sample of different departments around campus. And so the technical name for this kind of corpus is a sample corpus, because it's trying to draw somewhat equally from different places, and also a snapshot corpus because it's drawn from a particular time frame. I ended up with 19 syllabi in the corpus, and 11 of those were from STEM classes. Saving them as text.txt documents eliminated white space and pictures. Sometimes this might have biased my results a bit, because some instructors do intend they do put pictures in their syllabi, and they intend for students to draw some meaning from them. So, you know, eliminating them was not a neutral omission, but I had to do it because the software, concordancer software, doesn't read images. So just had to do it. I also cut all the mandatory language that's in syllabi that tends to be the same across every syllabus, either because the department or the university mandates particular language. And I cut this language just because if I included it, it would, first of all, it would bias my corpus towards the language that was required at my particular university rather than representative of syllabi, sorry, generally. And also because it would bias my corpus towards the very boilerplate language that's mostly, I think, written by lawyers. And if we're being honest, not read as carefully by students as the more important stuff, right? Like the due dates and things like that. Okay, so again, I cut all this stuff out of the syllabus corpus. So what was left was mostly stuff that was unique to that instructor and unique to that course. Okay, and I was left with this syllabus corpus, which I'm going to call the syllabus corpus from now on. Again, 19 syllabi, 37,000 plus tokens, more than 37,000 tokens. Tokens are just words or sometimes punctuation. And I compared that with 2 other corpora. COCA is a free corpus that anyone can use. If you Google COCA, you can find and use it. You have to register, but it's free. And then, so COCA includes a variety of different genres of language. So there's spoken language, there's language on television, movies, blogs, academic journals, of course, and things like newspapers, magazines, right? So COCA includes a variety of different genres of language and has way more tokens than my corpus, obviously. And I also compared my syllabus corpus to the COCA academic genre in particular. So within COCA, just the academic writing genre, which is mostly academic journals and like law reviews and things like that. The purpose was, again, to see if there were differences between language as it's used generally, academic language generally, and then my syllabus corpus. And this is what I found. The headline level results are, first of all, that I keep skipping slides. Certain words and word forms are really, really common on syllabi, and they're much more common than other words or other word forms, even ones that are superficially similar. and much more common on syllabi than in other contexts, right? So you see an example here, but there will be a lot more examples later. Skip. Yeah, so because these terms are so high frequency, they occur very often, at least once in every syllabus. They serve as sort of a bottleneck to understanding. So at the very least, if a student doesn't understand these words, they will not be able to understand syllabi. So, if we're going to teach particular words to students, hoping that they will understand syllabi better, we have a better understanding because of the study of what those words are and just how common they are. Yeah, I skipped another slide. That's what I just said was meant to be for this slide. Okay. Also, the language that appears on syllabi supports reading them first as contracts, and then in second place as a form of permanent record keeping for the university, although students don't necessarily care about that function of syllabi. And last, distant last, as learning tools for students, like informal learning tools from instructors to students. So again, first as contracts. Okay, so as examples of the first phenomenon that I pointed out, that words are much more common on syllabi than other words and much more common on syllabi than in other contexts, here are the most common words on syllabi. Some of these really do, let's say, if someone told you I was doing a corpus study of syllabi and they asked you to guess which words would be the most common, final and grade would not be surprising. You would expect to see final and grade on syllabi more often than in other contexts, and more often than apparent synonyms for final and grade, right? Like Mark is not in the top 10. Mark is my name, by the way. Hello. Final, obviously, because it's a reference to final exams or final grades, much more common than last, for example. And last is a synonym. But for obvious reasons, final is more common on syllabi. Some of the words are less obvious in why they would be more common on syllabi. For example, available or schedule or text or topics, right? Those words you might think, yeah, I can imagine those being on syllabi, but you wouldn't think that they would be something like 10 times more common in syllabi than they are in academic writing generally, or much more common than in COCA generally. COCA, again, was one of the reference syllabi, the reference corpora. Keep confusing syllabus and corpus here. Okay, so here are some examples of just the word assigned that might help you understand why it occurs so often in syllabi. So extra credit will be assigned at the discretion of the instructor. I'll let you read the other two. Basically, assigned is used very often in passive voice in syllabi and very, very often as an adjective. And that explains why you see assigned more often than assign or assignment, just because it's used this way so often. And I don't know exactly why instructors tend to phrase these sentences this way, but they all tended to do that. And that's why assigned was very, very common. So if you're just looking at verbs, you'll see a similar pattern, which is that the verb forms that are common in syllabi are much more common than other forms of the same verb, and also much more common on syllabi than in other contexts, right? So for example, you see here, these were the most common verbs, and for each of the common verbs, I looked up all of the forms separately in my corpora, just to verify to myself that, one was indeed much more common than the others. So you see, for example, in the verb demonstrate, that the form demonstrate, which is either, plural or first person present tense, or an infinitive, is much more common than demonstrating or demonstrated, both of which do not occur at all in the syllabi, in the syllabus corpus. And then demonstrates, I think, occurred like maybe once or twice. And then, so it's overwhelmingly more common than the other forms. It's also much more common in the syllabus corpus than in the other corpora. And in the other corpora, the forms of demonstrate are more evenly distributed, right? And that holds true for most of the other verbs here. So submit and submitted both occur in roughly equal proportions, but submits doesn't occur at all, which is interesting. And again, in the other corpora, it's more even. It's not flat, but it's more even than it is for the syllabi. And just to demonstrate, to show you, these are quotes from the corpus, the syllabus corpus. You can see why demonstrate occurs so often in that particular form, because it's very often used after a modal, like you must, in which case it has to be its bare infinitive or dictionary form, or it occurs after to, which is what we also call an infinitive, a to infinitive. And because it occurs in these contexts so much, that's why it occurs in this form, right? And again, much more common in this, much more common in this form than in any other form on syllabi. My fingers are, I don't know, my keyboard's sticky or something. So on to chunks. Again, chunks are groups of words that travel together, that appear together very often. We find basically the same pattern. The chunks that are common on syllabi are more common than other similar chunks, and more common on syllabi than in other contexts, right? Some of them, you would expect that. For example, by the end of this course is a chunk that occurs a lot in syllabi, and you would expect that to be on syllabi and not necessarily in academic writing or like television or something like that. Some of them are very common on syllabi, but for less obvious reasons, like we'll be able to. There's nothing about these 4 words that screams syllabus, and certainly doesn't say, I wouldn't expect this to be like 10 times more common in syllabi than on television, for example. But as we see here, it's much more common in syllabi than in other contexts, in other types of language. So some of the chunks, you can understand that. Some of them are a bit mysterious. Will be expected to is another one. It occurs almost never in academic writing generally, but very often in syllabi. And basically this has to do with the way learning outcomes are written. Learning outcomes are usually written with some version of will be able to or will be expected to. And that's what basically is responsible for these chunks being so overrepresented in the corpus. Now, importantly, learning outcomes like this are meant to be read as basically as commands. They're things that students have to do in order to be successful in, well, not in order to be successful, but in order to pass the course. They have to demonstrate that they can do these things. That interpretation of sentences like this is not obvious to students. And it really shouldn't be, because I don't know, like if I were learning passive voice in French, I wouldn't expect to interpret it as a command most of the time, right? If I were doing Duolingo in French and I were on the section for passive voice, nothing about the passive voice would tell me that, oh, this is, when you encounter this in your first year of university in France, it'll be something that you have to do in your course. That wouldn't occur naturally to me, and I suspect it doesn't occur naturally to our ESL students either. And that gets us into the discussion. So there's a philosopher of language who's still alive, and I checked, his name is John Searle, and he looked at language in its grammatical form as distinct from its purpose when said, or its intended effect on other people. He divided those effects into different categories that, again, were distinct from the grammatical form that they appeared in. So for example, you can make a promise, which John Searle would have called a commissive, that binds you to some future action. And you can do this with a variety of different grammar. You can say, I promise, which is probably the easiest way. You can say, on my mother's eyes, which has a completely different grammar form than I promise, but it has the same function. It has the same effect, right? That's what Searle was looking at, is the effect of those utterances, regardless of the grammatical form, or not necessarily dependent on the grammatical form. Okay, so he had commissives, which are basically promises, directives, which are basically commands, representatives, which are basically just saying this thing is true and you can hold me to that, right? Or I intend to convince you of that. Okay, so those categories are going to be germane for understanding syllabi, because a sentence like this, students will be expected to attend on that day in order to receive full credit. This comes from the syllabus corpus, is intended as a directive, right? The instructor is writing this in order to, command the students to do something, at least in a particular case. It's also a representative for the university. It binds the instructor to the truth of that proposition. That's in keeping with the purpose of the syllabus as a permanent record. Of course, students don't necessarily care about that. They really care about when the instructor is giving them a command, which, from the student's perspective, this sentence should be that. But again, it looks on its surface, students will be expected. It looks like a future passive voice declarative, as in something will happen at some point in the future. And, the directive function is not obvious to students, but, in keeping with the purpose of the syllabus as a contract, that's what the instructor intends it to be read as a directive. This sentence too, this is also from the syllabus corpus, is intended as a commissive to bind the instructor to specific behavior and also to command the students to do something. And again, it doesn't look that way if you just look at the grammar. All errors will be corrected. It could read as a prediction, right? It could read as a representative using the lingo we learned on the previous slide. But, instructors don't write sentences like this in syllabi intending them to be read as predictions. They intend them to be read as promises on the instructor's part and commands for the students. Okay, so back to this funky looking pyramid thingy. So we saw that the purposes of syllabi tend to be first as contracts, right? The purpose of a syllabus first is as a contract, and the other purposes are not necessarily relevant for students or very underrepresented in the kinds of language that appear on syllabi. And then, this is, yeah, I just said that, but the language used in syllabi supports this particular reading of syllabi. How many times have I said syllabi in this video? So to recap what we've learned, syllabi are mostly written as contracts, and that's the reason that you see so much of this kind of very same looking language in syllabi, is because the instructors formalize that purpose in particular ways in the language that they use. That's why will be able to occur so often. That's why a small group of words tend to have this bottleneck function, where if you don't understand them, you won't understand almost anything in the syllabus, because they're written with a very I guess pigeonholed is a bad way to put it, with a very specific purpose in mind, right? So that's tying it all together. Here are my works cited. I'm guessing you have questions. If I'm putting this on YouTube, I should say subscribe and comment. I don't know, subscribe, smash that like button, subscribe. You don't have to do that. I don't monetize anything that I put on YouTube. It's just for instructing. Okay, I've lost the ability to speak, so it's a good thing this is the end of the video. If you have any questions, let me know.